Alright, so let's go ahead and proceed with the next Java 2D API concept program that we have here. Now let's try to recreate what we call the fade out demo program. So in this example here, we will try to fade out an image. So using the concept that we actually used from the transparent rectangles program, we will try to make this image gradually uh, what you call this one, gradually decrease its transparency until it became completely invisible. Now we have what we call the step method, in which I will discuss during the code. It simply represents a fade out cycle, and the alpha is gradually decreased. Then you have to take note that the alpha value must not be negative when it reaches zero. The timer is stopped. So ideally, what you will try to do here in your program, you should actually try to implement and what we call the action listener para mas gumana ng maayos yung program natin. We also have what we call the repaint method here, in which simply repaints the component and invokes the paint method to the panel component, which in turn calls what we call paint component method. Now let's create here what we call the fade out x that Java class, and let's go ahead and create the fade out x. Tapos let's extend this using JFrame. Tapos let's write the main method na meron tayo. Ayan. And next is we will now try to at least import the following. Of course, we will try to import first the JFrame, tapos import natin si JPanel para at least mawala agad yung error dito. Diba? Now, since meron tayong particular timer na nabanggit ko kanina, kasi syempre, you have to be specific sa pag-fade out ng image natin. We will be using what we call the Java swing timer. And just like from the previous example here, we will also be importing the image icon. And since nagpa-fade out yan, it's also important for us to at least use what we call the action event and the listener to that one. So event, meron din tayo ditong action listener. Napaka-importante po niyan ha. Ayan. So java.out.image, meron din tayo niyan. Let's import the two java.out.graphics and java.out.graphics2d. Ayan. Tapos yung, let's not forget the event queue dun sa gagamitin natin sa main method natin. And the dimension of the image itself. Tapos what we call alpha composite. Ayan. So those are the following packages that we need to use in order for us to, or in order for this program to work. So using the event queue na tinatawag natin, let's try to invoke that using the new runnable method and the public void run inside that. Let's now instantiate the fade out x program. I'll name that as x new fade out x. Yan. Tapos i-set natin yung visibility niya as true. So we assume na mag-work na yan for now, diba? So work natin si public class natin, fade out extends JFrame. So inside here is where we will now be creating the constructor na tinatawag nating fade out x, which was actually derived from the class itself. Now, in the constructor, this is where you will call what we call the initUI method, in which we will also be creating private void initUI. Again, the purpose of this initUI method is just simply for us to set the properties of our JFrame. So let's pack that. Tapos i-set natin yung title. I'll name that as fade out. Let's set we call this one, the location relative. Yan. Tapos yung default close operation niya into jframe.exit and close. Now here, I would like to add a new jpanel. Yan. So tawagin natin si surface fade out. Yan. Na pangalan niya. In which, alam naman natin na kapag nag-create tayo ng ganyan, punta tayo dito sa taas and we create that as a separate class. Diba? So surface fade out. Yan. So class surface fade out, and the name of this one is actually, we will try to extend this jpanel, and we will also be implementing here the action listener natin, in which for now magkakaroon pa yan ng error because wala pa tayong totally ginagawa na method for the action listener. In order for us to remove that, let's create here the override annotation together with the method what we call action perform. I hope natatandaan nyo itong ano na to, ayan, action event E. Tapos we will call here the step method, and of course the repaint method na sinasabi ko kanina. So for now, i-comment out ko muna yan kasi yan yung tatawagin talaga natin eh, di ba? Mamaya dito sa loob ng action perform natin. So in the surface fade out, let's not forget that we need to also create the what we call the public void paint component, diba? Public void paint component. Yan, in which where the graphics G is included. Tapos si paint component natin, oops. Yan. Super the paint component graphics G, tapos i-bato rin natin siya kay method na do drawing. So we already know that the do drawing method here will be the one who will also cast the graphics into its corresponding graphics 2D. So we have here the private void do drawing method, diba? Tapos meron tayong graphics G, in which we will be casting that out, yan, G2D is equal to graphics 2D G.create. Ayan. So just like what we have done earlier, it's important for us to, number one, declare the following variables. So importante po na alam natin yung mga variables na i-declare natin. So the component here are the following. So we have the image, just like what we have done earlier. We have here the timer, which will serve as the timer for the fade out. We also have the alpha, which will serve as the transparency value, and I'll declare that as 1F as its initial value. And we also have here what we call the delay. Yan. The constant value of delay is around 40 milliseconds lang. Tapos yung initial delay niya, and initial underscore delay is also 500 milliseconds. So we have the initial delay, tapos magbabago yan up to the 40 later on. Okay, nagets ba natin yan? So far, okay naman, no? So we have here the do drawing. Now, let's create here the constructor, surface fade out. Yan. Constructor yan. Inside the constructor is where we will call the image. That's number 1. We will be setting the surface size. That's number 2. And we will also be setting the timer. So, for the load image, gawin ko muna siya isa-isa, private, para mawala yung error niyan. Private void load image. Yan. Tapos dito, private void set surface size, and another private void which is init timer. Ayan. So for the image here, since we already have identified the path of our image, I would like to use the img na dineclare natin kanina dito as a variable. So img new image icon, tapos ilagay natin dito yung source nung kanina, diba? So ganyan siya. And let's not forget the get image method. So that's how you load the image itself. Now for the surface size, that will now depend on the value of, or the size or the dimension of your image itself. So kukunin natin yan by simply getting the width, yan, which is, I'll reference that to itself. Tapos yung the height, this should be W, this should be H. Yan. Get height. Tapos, I'll reference that to itself. for the preferred size ng ating J panel, ilalagay natin yung magiging dimension ng kahit anong image na i-declare mo dito later on. So that's the surface size. Now for the timer, let's actually try to identify or create here the timer, in which will simply serve from the word itself, the delay of the timer itself. So alam naman natin na ang timer natin, the delay is 40, but then the initial is, and meron din tayong initial delay, which is set initial delay, which is the initial delay, which is in 400 milliseconds. So the timer starts. Yan. So far okay na, no? Wala na tayong magiging problema dito. Now for the step here na method, let's try to recreate this later on once na okay na lahat ng program natin. So ituloy na natin tong si do drawing, because we already know that the do drawing is where we will place the alpha composite. So using the alpha composite that we have learned earlier, we have here alpha composite, and I'll name that as atcom, is equal to alpha composite that get instance, tapos sa loob niyan is the alpha composite that src underscore over alpha, whatever the value of alpha here, which is initially, yan, is 1f. So mag-i-start siya from 100%, tapos gagawin natin dyan, i-decrease natin yung value niya later on. So G2G, let's set the composite here. Ayan, acom. Tapos ilagay na natin yung image. G2 draw image. Tapos lagay natin si img 00, tapos si null. Ayan. Saka natin siya i-dispose afterwards. But then the problem here, once the program actually started, yan, since pumunta na yan dito, alam naman natin na meron tayong action event eh. So automatic, once na nag-start yung program natin, the event will also automatically be triggered. That's why dito sa action perform natin, yun yung pinakauna ring mangyayari kasabay nitong part na to. So initially, ang gusto natin kasi mangyari dito, using the alpha here, we will try to decrease the value of alpha using a certain timer, diba? So napaka-importante po na alam natin na gumawa dito ng public void step na method, in which again we have here the value of the alpha, yan, which is also alpha plus negative 0.01f. So every time po na nag-run yung program mo, every time na nag-repaint yan, when I activated the repaint method here, every time na umaandar yan, nagbabawas yan ng at least value na 0.01%, or at least, you know, around 1% the value ng transparency. So once the alpha has reached a certain value, which is in 0 or less than or equal to 0, yan, kapag nandyan siya, the alpha will automatically be restarted to 0 and the timer will now stop. So ang ginagawa nito, kung i-analyze natin maigi, since nagbabawas nga, di ba? Binabawasan yung transparency like around 1% for every particular timer na meron tayo. Once na na-reach na yung 0 or nag 0% na yung transparency, saka mag-i-stop yung timer, and yung alpha is, of course, will automatically turn into 0. So yun yung purpose ng repaint dito, kasi ang repaint method here will simply repaint the entire process every time habang umaandar si program. So kung napansin natin dito, yan, diba? Tapos wala na nangyari, hindi na siya bumalik sa dati. Yan. So ganun po yun. So kailangan natin ulit siyang i-run. Of course, if you would like to make this as transparent na parang ganyan, tapos ibabalik mo sa dati, you have to at least modify the code in which certainly will do that for you. Diba? So that's actually how we try to fade out an image, which is, I think, very, very, it looks difficult, but then how you implement that is very easy at the same time. So ganyan siya. Alright, next. So in this example, we have what we call the method waiting demo program. So using still a transparency, ginagawa nito para alam mo yung alam mo yung parang YouTube loading. So, we will be using the transparency effect to create a waiting demo. Now, we draw 8 lines that gradually fade out, creating an illusion that a line is moving. So, ganun lang talaga yan. Basically, 8 lines lang yan. Hindi talaga siya totally nagbo-move, pero nagbabago lang yung transparency. Of course, we will be using here some particular code, especially for loop, para ma-achieve natin yan. Now, such effects are often used to inform users that a lengthy task is going on behind the scenes. Now, for instance, when streaming video over the internet. Now, let's try to create this one, and let's create what we call the waiting demo class. Alright, now, so let's create here the public class, waiting X. Tapos, I would like to extend that. Ganun din, same process pa rin po tayo, pero syempre may pagkakaiba lang kung paano natin siya implement, diba? So, public static, void, main, string, args. Tapos, inside here is where we will now be importing the following. Syempre, we have here the alpha composite. We have here, let's use the basic stroke. We also have here the event queue. Tapos si out, that graphics. By the way, pinapakita ko lang ito isa-isa ha. Pero again, pwede nyo gamitin ito ng asterisk lang. So kung ayaw nyo mag-type na napakaraming ganyan. So meron tayong rendering hints, the quality of rendering. We also have here the out, the action event. Java out, the action event. Nalimutan ko. Event, that action event. Tapos, Java that out, that event, that action listener. For every event, there should be a listener. Tapos, we have here import Javax, that swing, JFrame. Tapos, si JPanel, and lastly, the timer. Do not forget this, the timer. Alright, so let's work on the main method here. Okay, so alam naman natin kung anong gagawin natin dito, di ba? Event queue, dot invoke later, new runnable, and the public void run. So we have here the waiting X. Tapos meron tayong ganyan. Now let's set the visibility of this one into true. Once again. Yan. Let's now work on with the waiting X. Okay, so constructor, public waiting X. Ganyan. Tapos, let's call the init UI. And let's create the private void init UI here. Yan. Tapos, let's set the title. Oops. Set title waiting, for example. For loading, you can go ahead and do that. This time, since we are not using an image, let's set the size. Tapos, the location relative to. And set the default close operation into JFrame, that exit and close. Tapos, let's now create or add the JPanel. So, I'll name that as surface loading or waiting. For example, yan. Surface waiting. Ganyan. And this time, let's create here the separate class for that one. We have class surface waiting. And this time, we extend that as JPanel. Ganyan po. Okay. Now, since umiikot yan, kagaya rin ng ginawa natin dito kanina, meron din tayong action listener. Alright. So, let's try to remove first the errors na nakikita natin. Number 1, by simply creating the private void action listener. Diba? Or the action performed. I mean, action performed. Ayan. Tapos sa loob nito is si action event E. Ayan. And just like earlier, we have here the Repaint. Oops, hindi pala siya dapat private. Since ano siya. This should be public. So, public. Tapos, this should be Repaint, meaning mangyayari ng paulit-ulit. Ayan. Tapos, for now, ganyan muna. Alright, let's continue. So, we have here the action performed. Now, the error. Nawala na, diba? So, next here is the public void in component. And so, paulit-ulit lang yung process natin eh. So, dapat, ngayon, memorize na to. And super, the paint component G. Tapos, we will call the do drawing as usual. Diba? Tapos, we will add the override annotation. Now, for the do drawing here, we can just simply do private void do drawing. Ayan. Alright, so inside the do drawing, we already know that the do drawing here will simply accept the parameter from the graphics tree and will eventually cast the graphics tree into its graphics 2D, and we will create something out of it. Alright, so next here is for us to create what we call the constructor. We have public surface weighting, which is simply will call the timer. So dito kasi, ang purpose lang naman na ito is tatawagin natin itong si timer. Yan. Now, since we are talking about timer, it's time for us to at least declare the following variables. Number one, we have to declare the timer. Yan. Tapos, we can just simply declare a variable count. Yan. Mamaya, i-discuss ko kung ano ibig sabihin ni count yan. We also have here what we call the initial delay. Just like earlier. Kasi we are working on 8 different lines eh, di ba? So, dapat ma-identify din natin yung initial delay niya and yung magiging delay niya. So, the final int, of course, number of lines. Number of lines is equal to 8. Tapos, si int stroke width. Kung gaano kalaki or kakapal yung width mo. Now, this is actually one of the challenge because we would like to declare here a double array in which will now simply put all of what you call this one, all of the values nung square na, I mean nung line natin later on kasi nagcha-change yan eh. So I have prepared here the following values. Then we copy and paste that in a while. Yan. So, ito yung kung paano siya nag-change later on. So, 0, 15, 30, 5, 60, 80, 9, 1, 1, 0, 15, 35. So, kung napansin nyo, may paikot yan. 'Di ba? So, para siyang nagkikreate ng illusion later on. Mamaya, makikita natin kung anong purpose talaga nito. Now, let's work on the init timer. So, inside the init timer here is where we will now be creating the timer, new timer. Let's put here the delay. Yan. Tapos, set initial delay, or let's say timer dot set initial delay. Yan. Tapos, we start. Alright. So, this time we start, diba? Hindi siya totally mag-i-stop. So, mag-i-start pa lang siya at that time. Ngayon, so na-establish na natin lahat ng gusto natin mangyari, the size, the J-frame, the J-panel, and everything. It's actually time for us now to use the following coordinates here, the TRS. So, mamaya, gagamitin natin to. Saan kaya natin ilalagay yung part na to? Of course, dito sa do drawing. Diba? So, sa do drawing method, itutuloy natin to. Yan, sa do drawing. And number one, the first step here is, of course, let's set the rendering hints para mas maging maayos yung pagkaka-render ng ano natin, ng lines natin mamaya. Ayan. So, value anti-alias on. Tama ba? Rendering hints, dot key underscore anti-aliasing, and that value, or I mean, rendering hints, that value underscore anti-alias underscore on. So, I think tama naman, no? Or tama. Rendering hints. Ayan, tama pala ako. Sobra. So, ganyan siya. So, g2g dot set rendering hints. Set rendering hint, I mean. We have here the rendering hints. Tapos, key rendering. Ayan. Tapos, si rendering hints ulit. Value render quality. Ayan. Now, let's get the width and the height. Ano yung kinukuha natin dito? The width and the height of the J-frame itself. Oops, height pala to. Get height. Ayan. Now, let's try to stroke here. Gawin natin yung stroke natin. Set stroke. So, here, on this part, gagawin na natin yung mga line natin. So, the stroke width, oops, ulitin ka. G2G, that's set stroke. Ayan. New basic stroke. Tapos, yung stroke width natin. Tapos, yung basic stroke natin is cap underscore round. Kasi kapag cap underscore round yan, yung dulo niyan medyo rounded, diba? Pinag-aralan natin yan from the previous. So, cap round, meron din tayong basic stroke, property of the basic stroke here, which is, yan, join round. Ayan, so, naset na natin yung ano niya. Let's translate that. We can just simply translate that into width divided by 2. Hahatiin natin. Tapos yung height divided by 2. Ano ibig sabihin na ito? Ilalagay natin yung whatever stroke na sinet natin dito sa gitna ng width and height na kinuha natin from the entire J panel itself. Alright? So, next here is where we will now be creating a for loop for the, of course, number of lines. Ito ba yung number of lines natin kanina? 8. So, the number of lines here will be 8. So, automatic, kapag ka sumobra yan into like 9, hindi na yan, or the for loop will now break. So, for now, let's set the alpha. Yan. Let's set the alpha. Tapos, i-cast natin whatever the value of the TRS kanina. Yung kanina dito, di ba? This is actually the double, I mean, the 2D array. Ito. The transparency array, di ba? So, whatever value here, lagay natin dito is si number ni count. So, initially, si count kasi dito have an initial value of a null. Null muna. So, titingnan natin yan. I-fix natin yan later on. Since wala pa naman kasi talagang total or initial value si count, for now, ganyan muna siya. Hindi pa natin alam totally. So, count, we will actually see the modulo. So, whatever value here, say for example, 1 ang count yan, tapos yung number 9 niya is nasa 2 na. So, ibig sabihin, ang lalabas dito na value ni alpha is the address from 1 and whatever value here, which is 0. So, kung 1, 0 yan, ibig sabihin, ang lalabas na value initially is ito. So, hanggang umikot yan. Hanggang umikot yung transparency niya. So, imagine, these numbers here are actually being called, these are transparencies. Kaya nga TRS, diba? So, these are transparencies. Starting from 0, umiikot yung transparency ng isang line starting from 0 until mapunta siya sa 100% transparency. Tapos, bumalik siya ulit sa 0 until bumalik siya sa transparency ng 1. Pabalik ulit dito sa may ganyan. And so on and so forth. Kasi kung hindi ko gagawin ito, medyo mahirapan tayo totally. Diba? So, meron tayo dito number of lines. Ang purpose naman nito is simply checking the address of the alpha. So, since we already identified the address of the alpha, let's now use the alpha composite, acomp. Ayan. Tapos, si alpha composite dot get instance. Tapos, si alpha composite .src underscore over with a value of the alpha itself. Initially, the value of the alpha that we know as for now is whatever the value na tinuro niya dito from the address ni transparency. Yun po yun. So, dito yun mag-check sa 2D array na to. src underscore over. Yeah. Tapos, let's set the composition or the composite just like what we have done earlier. Tapos, we will now try to rotate using matpy, which is 3.14 divided by 4 float. Ano ang niro-rotate natin dito? Yung mismong line natin. Tapos, saka natin i-draw ngayon si line. So, the draw line here is actually the same, which is from 0 to negative 10, tapos negative 40. Yan, for now, ganyan lang muna siya. 0, negative 10, 0, negative 40. Draw line. And lastly, we dispose everything. Now, I have mentioned here that the value of count is nothing for now. Diba? Wala talagang value asan ba yung si count natin? Ito. Ngayon, papasok yan dito sa action perform. Once the program actually started, automatic that the value of count will now be initialized as 1. So, dito, count plus plus. Kasi nagre-repaint din yan. So, ibig sabihin, every time na umiikot or every time na nagpapakita yung line. Ayan. So, I think okay na tayo dito. This is simply the value. Okay? The value of the draw line itself. And let's see. Ayun. So, kung titingnan natin maigi, again, hindi yan totally umiikot. Pero, ang ginagawa lang niya talaga is yung transparency niya. Ayan. So, from here, TRS is, the count will start from 1, and the number of lines will be 8. So, automatic, the value of TRS here as the first value of the 2D array is 1, and the value of I here will start from 0. 1 and 0 is actually automatic, this one. So, it will automatically start from 0. Yan. Until maging 0, maging 100%, babalik sa 0, babalik sa 100%. Ngayon, kung nagtataka kayo kung paano gumit na yan, once again, dito po yan sa G2D translate. We simply get the width and the height of the entire J-frame and divide them by 2, and we place them, the lines here. And take note ha, nag-draw line tayo sa loob ng for loop. Ang purpose nito, itong 0, negative 10, and 0, and negative 40 are just simply the coordinate of the first line lang. Since we tried to include here, or include this inside the for loop, nag-create siya ng illusion na nag-create siya ng ganyan. 8 beses. So, every time na nag-create ka, or tinawag mo yung unang address ng transparency, nag-rotate ng 1 beses, nag-draw ng line ng unang beses. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 times pong mangyayari yan dito. So, what will happen if we change the value of rotate? Diba? Itong rotate, naging 2. Ayun. Diba? So, kung napansin nyo, yung value naman ng rotate, yung naging 2, hindi na siya nagmukhang loading screen, but rather, nag-create lang siya ng nag-4 lang. Hindi na siya naging circle. Ideal kasi dyan is 4 talaga. So, kapag ginawa natin itong 8, let's see, ang number of lines natin is until 8 lang. Pero, ayan, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, kung gusto nyong mas dami ito, dagdagan nyo yung number of lines, tapos, yung, ito, hindi siya 4 lang. Ay, tama, hindi lang siya 8. Ayan. So, ideal is 4 para mag-rotate siya. So, that's actually how you create a program with that looks like a waiting demo or a loading screen sa atin. So, in the next part of the module, we will discuss what we call the composition.